"When are you going to admit you were wrong?" my mother asked across the dinner table, and without raising my voice or looking away, I answered, "When the facts change." The room became so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking between us, each second sounding louder than the last. My sister slowly lowered her fork onto her plate. My father stared down at his coffee cup without saying a word. My mother, Margaret Brooks, looked at me as though she no longer recognized the son she had raised. If someone had told me 10 years earlier that a single sentence would become the dividing line between my old family and whatever came after, I would have laughed. Back then, we agreed on almost everything that mattered. My mother had always been the person I called first whenever life became complicated. She taught me how to ride a bicycle on the cracked sidewalk outside our small Ohio home. She stayed awake beside my bed through childhood fevers, drove hundreds of miles to watch my college graduation, and cried when I accepted my first job. To me, she was the strongest person I had ever known. She believed that standing by your family mattered more than anything else. She believed that honesty was sacred, promises were permanent, and if two people loved each other enough, they could solve almost any problem simply by sitting down together. Those were the lessons I grew up believing. Maybe that's why what happened later hurt so much. It wasn't because we suddenly hated each other. It was because we both thought we were protecting something worth saving. The Sunday dinners had been our family's tradition for nearly 40 years. Every week, my parents opened their front door before noon, and by 1 o'clock everyone gathered around the same oak table my grandfather had built with his own hands. My mother always made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, homemade rolls, and an apple pie that filled the entire house with cinnamon before anyone even arrived. It never mattered whether someone had a stressful week or missed a promotion or argued with a spouse. For a few hours every Sunday, we were simply family. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I realize traditions don't disappear overnight. They fade one uncomfortable conversation at a time. The first signs were almost invisible. Conversations became shorter. Laughs became polite instead of genuine. People changed the subject whenever difficult questions appeared. We all smiled for family photographs, but nobody stayed in the kitchen afterward to keep talking like we used to. It was as if everyone sensed a storm approaching, but hoped pretending the sky was blue would somehow stop the rain from coming. My wife, Emily, noticed it long before I did. One evening while we were washing dishes together, she quietly asked, "Do you ever feel like everyone is walking around something they refuse to name?" I shrugged because I honestly didn't know what she meant. "They're just getting older," I said. "Families change." She nodded, but her expression told me she wasn't convinced. I wish I had listened more carefully. I wish I had understood that silence can sometimes be louder than shouting. The argument everyone remembers actually started weeks before that Sunday dinner, although nobody realized it at the time. It began with a simple conversation that should have lasted 5 minutes, and somehow kept growing until it reached every corner of our family. At first, I assumed time would solve everything. People calm down. Misunderstandings fade. New information changes old opinions. That's how I'd always believed life worked. I never imagined that two people could look at the same evidence, love each other deeply, and still end up living in completely different versions of reality. Every phone call with my mother became just a little more careful. Every visit ended just a little earlier. Every goodbye felt just a little colder. Neither of us apologized because neither of us believed we had done anything wrong. Pride is strange that way. It rarely announces itself. It simply whispers that waiting for the other person to take the first step is reasonable. Before long, weeks had turned into months, and the distance between us could no longer be measured in miles. It lived inside every unfinished sentence and every conversation we decided wasn't worth having. Then came that Sunday. The sunlight poured through the dining room windows exactly as it always had. The table looked exactly the same. The food tasted exactly the same. Even the old clock sounded exactly the same. Everything familiar remained untouched except the people sitting around it. I remember noticing how carefully my mother folded her napkin before speaking, as though she had rehearsed the question in her mind all morning. She looked directly at me with eyes that once made every problem in my childhood feel smaller. "Daniel," she said softly, "when are you finally going to admit you were wrong?" I met her gaze and answered with the only words that felt honest. "When the facts change." Nobody spoke after that. Not because they were angry. Because every person at that table understood, in that single quiet moment, that our family had just crossed a line none of us yet knew how to uncross. For the next several days, I kept replaying that dinner in my mind, not because I regretted what I had said, but because I could not stop wondering how two people who loved each other so deeply had reached a place where every conversation felt like a test that someone had to fail. My mother had never raised me to argue for the sake of winning. She had raised me to ask questions, to read carefully, to think before speaking, and to admit mistakes whenever I made them. When I was 10 years old, she used to take me to the public library every Saturday morning. We would leave the house just after breakfast, stop at the little bakery on Main Street for cinnamon rolls, and spend hours walking between shelves filled with books about history, science, biographies, and anything else that caught my attention. She always smiled when I checked out a stack that looked far too heavy for a child to carry. She would tell me that learning never made anyone weaker. It made them harder to fool. Those afternoons shaped the person I eventually became. Whenever I faced a difficult decision, my instinct was always to gather information before reaching a conclusion. I honestly believed she had given me that habit. That was why everything felt so confusing now. Somewhere along the way, the very lessons she had taught me seemed to collide with the conclusions she had reached herself. I did not know when the change had begun. There was no dramatic announcement and no single event that separated the old days from the new ones. It happened quietly, almost politely, one conversation at a time. At first, our weekly phone calls became shorter. We stopped talking about books we had both enjoyed and started avoiding subjects that might lead to disagreement. Then family dinners became more careful. My father, Richard, who had always enjoyed telling long stories about his years working as an electrician, suddenly spent more time listening than speaking. My younger sister, Claire, developed an impressive talent for changing the subject whenever she sensed tension beginning to grow. Even my wife, Emily, who had always been welcomed like another daughter in my parents' home, noticed that everyone seemed to measure each sentence before saying it aloud. One Friday evening, as we drove home after visiting my parents, Emily reached over and gently squeezed my hand. She waited until we had turned onto the highway before speaking. She knew me well enough to understand that silence usually meant I was thinking harder than I wanted to admit. "Do you think your mother is angry with you?" she asked softly. I stared at the headlights stretching across the dark road ahead. "I do not think she is angry," I answered after a long pause. "I think she is disappointed." Emily nodded slowly. "Sometimes disappointment hurts more than anger because it lasts longer." Her words stayed with me. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the small moments that I had ignored before. My mother no longer called just to ask how work was going. She no longer sent photographs of flowers blooming in her garden or recipes she thought Emily might enjoy trying. Our conversations became practical. She asked whether we would be coming for Sunday dinner. She reminded me about my father's medical appointment. She mentioned birthdays and anniversaries. Then she politely ended the call. Every sentence sounded perfectly normal, yet something warm had quietly disappeared. I missed it more than I wanted to admit. One afternoon, I opened an old family photo album while cleaning out a closet in our house. There was a picture of my mother standing beside me on my first day of kindergarten. I was wearing a backpack that looked almost as big as I was. She had one hand resting gently on my shoulder, smiling with complete confidence, as though she believed the world would always make sense if we were honest with each other. Another photograph showed us building a treehouse during one unusually warm October weekend. My father had measured every board twice before cutting it, while my mother laughed because neither of us seemed capable of holding a hammer correctly. Looking at those pictures, I realized that none of us had expected family to become complicated. We assumed love would naturally carry us through every disagreement. We never considered that affection alone might not be enough if people slowly stopped listening. A few days later, Claire called unexpectedly. She almost never phoned during the workday, so I stepped outside my office building to answer. Her voice sounded unusually cautious. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." There was a brief silence before she continued. "Do you actually want to fix things with Mom?" The question caught me off guard because it suggested there were people who believed I did not. "More than anything," I replied immediately. "Then stop trying to convince her," Claire said quietly. "She thinks every conversation has become a debate. She misses her son. She does not want another argument." I leaned against the brick wall outside the building and closed my eyes. I am not trying to argue, I said. I am trying to understand. Claire sighed. I know that, but I do not think she can hear the difference anymore. After we ended the call, I stood there for several minutes watching people hurry down the sidewalk carrying coffee cups, grocery bags, and briefcases. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be. I suddenly realized that while I had been focusing on proving my point, my family had been quietly measuring something completely different. They were not asking who was correct. They were asking whether we still knew how to sit at the same table without feeling like strangers. That thought stayed with me all the way home, and for the first time, I began wondering whether the distance between my mother and me had started long before either of us noticed it. The following Sunday arrived with the kind of bright autumn weather that usually made everything feel familiar. The maple trees lining my parents' street had begun turning shades of gold and deep red, and children were riding bicycles along the sidewalks, just as I had done decades earlier. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that anything had changed. Only the people inside the houses knew how much could happen without anyone else noticing. Emily and I drove in silence for most of the trip. The radio remained off. She rested one hand on the center console, occasionally glancing toward me, as though trying to decide whether speaking would help or only make the afternoon more difficult. I appreciated that about her. She never filled silence simply because it felt uncomfortable. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, my father's old pickup truck was already there, along with Claire's small sedan. Everything looked exactly as it always had. My mother had even placed the same flower pots beside the front porch that she carefully replanted every spring. She greeted us with a warm smile that looked genuine from a distance, but as she hugged me, I noticed something different. She let go just a little sooner than she used to. It was such a small detail that anyone else would have missed it, yet I felt it immediately. Love rarely disappears all at once. Sometimes it simply becomes more cautious. The house smelled like roasted turkey, fresh bread, and pumpkin pie. My father was setting glasses on the dining room table while humming an old country song under his breath. Claire was arranging serving bowls exactly the way our mother liked them. For a few minutes, everything felt almost normal. Emily complimented the centerpiece. My father joked about spending half the morning searching for his reading glasses only to discover them in his shirt pocket. Everyone laughed politely. It sounded convincing enough that an outsider might have believed we were simply another happy family enjoying another ordinary Sunday together. During lunch, conversations floated from one harmless subject to another. Claire talked about a project at work. Emily shared pictures of our neighbor's new golden retriever puppy. My father described how he had finally repaired the old fence behind the garage after putting it off all summer. My mother listened carefully, smiling at the appropriate moments, asking thoughtful questions, making certain everyone had enough food on their plates. Watching her move around the table reminded me of countless Sundays from my childhood. She had always believed that caring for people was something you demonstrated through ordinary acts. Refilling a glass before someone asked, remembering exactly how each person liked their coffee, saving the last dinner roll for whoever arrived hungry. Those gestures had shaped the atmosphere of our family for years. That was why the quiet moments between us felt even heavier than spoken disagreements. They existed in sharp contrast to everything she naturally wanted family life to be. After dessert, Emily offered to help wash dishes while Claire dried them. My father wandered into the living room to watch a football game that he barely seemed interested in following. I stepped onto the back porch carrying a mug of coffee, hoping a few minutes alone would settle the uneasy feeling that had followed me all afternoon. The backyard looked almost unchanged since I was a teenager. The oak tree where I had once built a swing still stood near the fence. The bird feeder my grandfather had made years before remained hanging from the same branch. Time had moved forward, but pieces of the past refused to leave. A few minutes later, I heard the screen door open behind me. My mother stepped outside carrying her own cup of coffee. Neither of us spoke immediately. We stood side by side watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the lawn. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you remember building that bird feeder with your grandfather?" she asked quietly. I smiled. I remember thinking I had done most of the work. She laughed softly. "You mostly handed him nails." For the first time in weeks, the conversation felt natural. We talked about my grandparents, about old vacations, about Christmas mornings when Claire and I used to wake everyone before sunrise. It reminded me that beneath all the recent tension, we still shared decades of memories that no disagreement could erase. Then, almost without warning, the atmosphere shifted again. My mother looked toward the fence instead of at me. "I keep wondering," she said slowly, "whether things would be easier if people cared less about proving themselves right." Her voice remained calm. There was no accusation in it, only sadness. I considered answering immediately, but something stopped me. Claire's words echoed in my mind. She misses her son. She does not want another argument. Instead of defending myself, I simply asked, "Do you think that is what has been happening?" She hesitated before nodding. I think somewhere along the way we all forgot how to listen. Those words stayed with me long after Emily and I drove home that evening. They were the first thing my mother had said in months that sounded less like a position and more like a confession. For the first time, I began wondering if the disagreement we kept talking about was only the surface of something much older and much more painful, something neither of us had found the courage to name. During the weeks that followed, I stopped looking for dramatic moments because I had finally realized our family was not falling apart through loud arguments. It was changing through small choices that seemed harmless on their own. My mother no longer asked for my opinion when she was planning family gatherings. Instead, she called Claire first. My father still invited me to help him with little projects around the house, but even he seemed careful to avoid subjects that might lead us into another uncomfortable conversation. Nobody announced these new rules. They simply became part of the rhythm of our lives. At first, I convinced myself that I was imagining the difference. Then one Saturday morning, my father called and asked if I could help him replace the weather stripping around the front door before winter arrived. I drove over with a toolbox in the back of my car, grateful for an excuse to spend time with him. Working beside my father had always been easy because he rarely felt the need to fill every quiet moment with conversation. We measured the old strips, cut new pieces, and carefully fitted them into place while a cool breeze carried the smell of fallen leaves across the yard. After nearly an hour, he finally set his utility knife on the porch railing and leaned back with a tired smile. "Getting older makes simple jobs take longer," he said with a quiet laugh. "Maybe they just make us appreciate them more," I answered. He nodded thoughtfully before looking toward the kitchen window where my mother was arranging flowers in a vase. "Your mother has not been sleeping well," he said. "She worries more than she lets people see." I looked through the glass and watched her moving from one side of the kitchen to the other. From a distance, she looked exactly as she always had, calm, organized, and completely in control. "Has she said why?" I asked. My father took a long breath before answering. "She thinks she is losing something she cannot explain." His words stayed with me long after I drove home that afternoon. Losing something. It sounded different from losing an argument. It sounded much deeper than that. A few days later, Emily and I were cleaning out the guest room because her cousin planned to visit for Thanksgiving. While sorting through old storage boxes, I found a small wooden plaque my mother had given me when I graduated from college. The words carved into the oak were simple. "Never be afraid of the truth, even when it surprises you." I turned the plaque over in my hands several times, wondering how two people who both believed those words could now find themselves standing on opposite sides of nearly every difficult conversation. Emily noticed the expression on my face and sat beside me on the floor. "You have been thinking about your parents every day," she said gently. I smiled without denying it. "I keep trying to figure out where everything changed." She rested her hand over mine. "Maybe you are asking the wrong question." I looked at her. "Then what should I be asking?" She waited a moment before replying. "Instead of asking when everything changed, ask what everyone is afraid of losing." That question settled into my thoughts like a seed waiting for rain. Over the next several days, I began noticing things that I had ignored before. My mother never spoke about being right when she talked with Claire. She talked about traditions. She talked about family dinners becoming smaller. She talked about neighbors whose children rarely visited anymore. She talked about how quickly the world seemed to move and how difficult it had become to recognize it. None of those conversations were really about current events or disagreements. They were about uncertainty. They were about watching familiar things disappear one piece at a time. The realization made me uncomfortable because it forced me to see my mother differently. Until then, I had assumed we were having an intellectual disagreement. I had approached every difficult conversation as though enough patience and enough evidence would eventually bring us back together. But evidence rarely comforts someone who feels that the foundation beneath their feet is shifting. Facts answer questions. Fear asks entirely different ones. One evening, Claire invited Emily and me over for dinner. After the meal, while Emily helped clear the table, Claire quietly poured 2 cups of coffee and motioned toward the back patio. The air had turned noticeably colder, and we wrapped our hands around the warm mugs as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Claire looked at me carefully before speaking. "Do you know what Mom told me yesterday?" she asked. I shook my head. "She said she misses laughing with you." I felt my chest tighten. Claire continued before I could answer. "She said every conversation feels like both of you are carrying invisible notebooks where you keep score." I stared into my coffee without saying anything. The image hurt because it felt painfully accurate. Somewhere along the way, every discussion had quietly become a contest that neither of us had intended to create. We both arrived hoping to be understood, yet we each left believing the other had stopped listening. As I drove home that night, I realized something that had never occurred to me before. My mother and I had spent months trying to protect what we believed was true, but neither of us had spent enough time protecting the relationship itself. We had treated trust as though it could survive indefinitely, without care, simply because it had existed for so many years. I suddenly understood that even the strongest bridges require maintenance. Ignore the smallest cracks for too long, and one day people stop crossing them, not because they hate what waits on the other side, but because they are no longer certain the bridge will hold. Thanksgiving arrived sooner than I expected, bringing with it the familiar routines that had always made the holiday feel dependable. Emily woke before sunrise to prepare the pumpkin pie she'd baked every year, filling our kitchen with the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and butter. I chopped vegetables while the coffee brewed, and for a little while life felt wonderfully ordinary. Yet beneath every ordinary moment was the quiet awareness that this gathering would be different. Not because anyone planned to argue, but because everyone would arrive carrying the memory of conversations that had never truly ended. When we reached my parents' house that afternoon, the driveway was already full. Claire greeted us warmly, my father shook my hand with his usual easy smile, and my mother hugged Emily first before turning to me. The embrace was kind, but careful, as though both of us feared saying the wrong thing before the day had even begun. The dining room looked exactly as it had every Thanksgiving since I was a child. The polished oak table reflected the soft light from the chandelier. The same embroidered tablecloth covered the surface. My mother had placed handwritten name cards beside every plate, even though everyone already knew where they always sat. She believed traditions deserved attention because they reminded people that some things could still be counted on. I wondered if that was why she protected them so fiercely. During dinner, everyone made an obvious effort to keep the conversation light. Claire described a weekend hiking trip with friends. My father proudly explained how he had finally organized the garage after talking about it for nearly 5 years. Emily shared stories from work that made everyone laugh. Even my mother seemed more relaxed than she had in weeks. Watching her smile reminded me how much I had missed seeing her genuinely happy. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe we were finally finding our way back to each other. Then my young nephew, Ethan, asked a question that changed the atmosphere without realizing it. "Grandma," he said innocently, "why do adults stop talking to each other when they disagree?" The room became unexpectedly quiet. Ethan looked around, confused by everyone's sudden silence. He had asked the question with the simple honesty only children possess. He was not accusing anyone. He was trying to understand the world around him. My mother looked at him with gentle eyes before answering. Sometimes grown-ups forget that the person across the table matters more than the argument. Her voice was soft, almost reflective. Nobody spoke for several seconds afterward. I found myself studying her expression instead of my plate. Those words did not sound like someone trying to defend a position. They sounded like someone quietly mourning something that had slipped away. After dinner, while everyone else gathered in the living room to watch football, I stayed behind to help my mother clear the table. For years we had worked side by side after holiday meals without thinking twice about it. We passed serving bowls, wrapped leftovers, and loaded the dishwasher in an easy rhythm that had once felt effortless. This time, however, every ordinary movement seemed to carry memories neither of us mentioned. As she carefully rinsed a serving platter, she spoke without looking at me. "Do you know what I miss the most?" she asked. I shook my head. "I miss calling you when something interesting happened without wondering whether the conversation would become difficult." I stopped drying the plate in my hands. There was no frustration in her voice, only sadness. "I miss that too. I admitted quietly. She nodded, but did not immediately respond. The water continued running into the sink, filling the silence between us. Finally, she turned off the faucet and dried her hands with a kitchen towel. "You know," she said, "when you were little, you asked questions about everything. I love that about you. I never wanted you to stop thinking for yourself." I looked at her, unsure where the conversation was leading. She smiled faintly. "Somewhere along the way, I started feeling like every answer pulled you farther away from me instead of bringing us closer." Her words caught me completely off guard because they revealed something I had never considered. I had assumed our distance came from disagreement. She experienced it as loss. To her, each difficult conversation felt like another reminder that the little boy who once trusted her completely had grown into a man who no longer needed her guidance. Standing there in the warm kitchen, surrounded by familiar dishes and familiar holiday smells, I realized we had been measuring entirely different things. I had been asking whether we could agree again. She had been wondering whether we could still belong to each other despite our differences. Those were not the same question. They never had been. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Emily and I sat quietly in our living room with cups of tea. She listened patiently as I repeated every word my mother had said in the kitchen. When I finished, Emily smiled gently. "Now you are finally hearing what she has been trying to tell you all along," she said. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the window at the first light snowfall of the season drifting beneath the streetlights. For months, I had believed our family was trapped by opposing conclusions. Now I was beginning to understand that the real problem had started much earlier. We had stopped translating our fears into words the other person could recognize. We both believed we were protecting something precious, yet neither of us had explained what that precious thing actually was. Until we did, every conversation would continue missing the place where healing truly needed to begin. Winter settled over Ohio with a quiet confidence that reminded me of my mother. Snow covered the neighborhood in a clean white blanket, softening sharp edges and hiding imperfections that still existed underneath. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. Families hung wreaths on their front doors. Children built snowmen in their front yards. Christmas lights stretched across rooftops, glowing warmly against the early evening sky. Yet I had finally learned that appearances could be comforting without being complete. A family could gather around the same table, exchange thoughtful gifts, smile for photographs, and still carry questions that nobody felt brave enough to ask. A week before Christmas, my father called and invited me to help him choose a new rocking chair for the front porch. The old one had finally given out after nearly 30 years. It seemed like an ordinary errand, and perhaps that was exactly why he suggested it. My father had always believed that difficult conversations happen more naturally when people were doing something practical with their hands. We spent nearly 2 hours visiting furniture stores before finding one made from solid oak with a high back and wide armrests. He sat down in it, leaned back, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Your mother will like this one," he said. "She always sits on the porch after dinner once the weather gets warm." As the salesman completed the paperwork, my father remained unusually thoughtful. Finally, he looked at me and spoke so softly that I almost missed his words. "Your mother still keeps every birthday card you have ever given her." I looked at him, surprised. "Every one." He nodded. "She has them in a small cedar chest upstairs. She reads them more often than you probably realize." The image stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. I remembered making handmade cards with crooked crayons when I was 6 years old. I remembered buying my first real greeting card with money I earned mowing lawns as a teenager. I remembered writing long messages after leaving for college because I wanted her to know I missed home even when I pretended I did not. Somehow, through every season of life, she had kept them all. That evening, after Emily and I finished decorating our Christmas tree, I told her what my father had shared. She smiled gently before hanging one final ornament on a branch near the top. "People rarely save things that do not matter," she said. "Sometimes the smallest objects tell the biggest story." Her words echoed in my mind over the following days. I began thinking less about our disagreements and more about the years that came before them. My mother had attended every school concert, every baseball game, every graduation. She had stayed awake helping me study when exams felt impossible. She had believed in me long before I believed in myself. None of those memories disappeared simply because we now viewed some things differently. If anything, Those memories deserved more attention than the disagreements that had temporarily pushed them into the background. A few days before Christmas Eve, Claire called again. This time her voice sounded lighter than it had in months. "Mama's been going through old photo albums," she said. She laughed for almost an hour looking at pictures from our camping trips. I smiled. "I remember those trips. Dad always forgot at least one important thing." Claire laughed. "One year he forgot the coffee. Mom said that was the closest she had ever come to believing your father was not perfect." We both laughed together, and for a moment the conversation felt wonderfully familiar. Then Claire became quiet again. "She asked me something today," she said. "She wondered whether you still think about those old vacations as often as she does." I did not answer immediately because the truth surprised even me. I thought about them all the time. I thought about the mornings when my mother would wake before everyone else to make pancakes over a small camp stove, while the rest of us slowly crawled out of our sleeping bags. I remembered rainy afternoons spent playing card games inside the tent because the weather refused to cooperate. I remembered watching my parents laugh together around a campfire after believing Claire and I had already fallen asleep. Those memories had quietly shaped my understanding of what family meant. They had never disappeared. I simply had not spoken about them. Christmas Eve arrived with gentle snowfall drifting past the windows of my parents' house. The familiar decorations filled every room, including the handmade ornaments my sister and I created in elementary school that my mother still proudly displayed every year. During dinner, conversations flowed more naturally than they had in months. Nobody forced them. Nobody carefully steered away from uncomfortable subjects. Instead, everyone shared stories from years gone by. We laughed about old family vacations, forgotten recipes, and childhood misunderstandings that now seemed charming instead of embarrassing. I noticed my mother watching everyone with quiet gratitude, as though she was trying to memorize the moment. Later that evening, after most of the dishes had been cleared away, she walked over to the Christmas tree and picked up one of the oldest ornaments hanging near the back where few people noticed it. It was a simple paper star I had made in second grade. The edges were uneven, the glitter had faded, and one side was slightly bent. She held it carefully in her hands before looking at me with a gentle smile. "You wanted to throw this away the year after you made it," she said. "You thought it looked childish." I laughed softly. "It probably did." She shook her head. "I kept it because it reminded me that love does not have to be perfect to be worth holding on to." Her words settled quietly between us. For the first time in many months, neither of us felt the need to explain ourselves or defend our thoughts. We simply stood there beside the tree, surrounded by years of shared memories, beginning to understand that the strongest parts of a family are not built by always agreeing. They are built by remembering why you chose one another long before any disagreement ever arrived. January arrived with the quiet stillness that always follows the holidays. The decorations had been packed away, the family photographs from Christmas had already found their places in albums, and life slowly returned to ordinary routines. Yet something inside me had changed. For the first time in months, I was no longer searching for the perfect explanation that would somehow erase every disagreement. Instead, I found myself asking a different question each morning. If I truly wanted my relationship with my mother back, what would I have to give up first? Pride offered an easy answer. It whispered that the other person should make the first move because that would prove they cared. Love asked something much harder. It asked whether I valued being understood more than understanding someone else. One Saturday afternoon, Emily suggested we drive to the small bookstore downtown where my mother had taken me countless times as a child. "You always seem calmer there," she said with a gentle smile. She was right. The familiar scent of old paper, polished wooden shelves, and fresh coffee from the little cafe inside brought back memories I had not visited in years. I wandered through the history section before finding myself standing in front of the shelf where my mother used to let me choose one new book every month. I could almost hear her voice reminding me that curiosity was never something to outgrow. As I stood there, I suddenly realized something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. My mother had never wanted me to stop asking questions. She had simply never imagined that one day we would ask different questions about the same world. That realization softened something inside me. It did not change what I believed, but it changed the way I remembered her. She was not the villain in my story. She was the same woman who had spent years encouraging me to think for myself, even though neither of us understood where that path might eventually lead. Before leaving the bookstore, I bought a leather-bound journal. Emily noticed my puzzled expression as the cashier placed it into a paper bag. "What is the journal for?" she asked while we walked toward the parking lot. I smiled slightly. "I am not completely sure yet." That evening, after dinner, I opened the journal and began writing memories instead of arguments. I wrote about the time my mother waited outside my elementary school in the rain because she refused to let me walk home soaked. I wrote about learning to drive, while she patiently reminded me to breathe whenever I became nervous. I wrote about the day she hugged me after my first major disappointment and told me that failure was simply another teacher wearing uncomfortable clothes. Page after page filled with moments that had nothing to do with disagreements. By the end of the evening, I realized I had written nearly 20 pages without mentioning a single argument. The next morning, I called my father. We spoke about ordinary things for several minutes before I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me. "Dad, when you and Mom disagree, how do you always seem to find your way back?" He laughed quietly. "Who told you we always do?" I smiled. "You know what I mean." He grew thoughtful before answering. "Your mother and I stopped trying to change each other a long time ago. We still challenge each other. We still ask difficult questions. But eventually we learned that understanding why someone believes something is usually more important than proving they should believe something else." I remained silent while his words settled in. "Do you know what your mother fears the most?" he continued. I admitted that I did not. "She is afraid that one day everyone she loves will slowly become strangers while still calling themselves family." I closed my eyes. Hearing those words spoken aloud made everything feel painfully clear. She had never been fighting to win. She had been fighting against loneliness. A few days later, Claire invited me to join her for lunch. We met at a small diner that our family had visited for years after church on special occasions. While we waited for our meals, she studied me with the kind of expression only a younger sister can wear, one that mixes affection with complete honesty. "You seem different," she said. "Maybe I am." She smiled. "Less determined to convince everyone." I laughed softly. "Definitely less determined." Claire stirred her soup before speaking again. "Mom has changed too." I looked up. "How?" "She stopped asking whether you would ever admit you were wrong. Now she keeps asking whether she pushed you away without realizing it." Those words remained with me long after lunch ended. For months, I had imagined that my mother saw me as someone she needed to defeat. Instead, she had quietly begun questioning herself. We had both spent the same months lying awake at night wondering whether we had already lost something neither of us wanted to lose. That realization did not erase the distance between us, but it transformed the meaning of that distance. It was no longer a wall built by enemies. It was a bridge left unfinished by two people who still cared enough to stand on opposite sides waiting for the other to take one more step. As winter slowly gave way to the first signs of spring, I made a promise to myself. The next meaningful conversation I had with my mother would not begin with opinions, evidence, or conclusions. It would begin with gratitude. Before either of us could understand the future, we needed to remember the years that had already proven we belonged in each other's lives. For the first time since all of this had begun, that felt less like hope and more like the beginning of wisdom. The first warm Saturday of spring arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fresh grass through the neighborhood. My mother called early that morning, something she had not done in a very long time. Her voice sounded calm, almost hesitant. "Your father is helping a neighbor this afternoon," she said. "Would you like to come over for coffee?" There was no hidden meaning in her invitation. No careful wording. No subject she wanted to introduce before I arrived. It was simply an invitation to spend time together. "I would like that," I answered without hesitation. As I drove toward my parents' house, I noticed something different about my own thoughts. Months earlier, I would have rehearsed possible conversations during the entire drive. I would have prepared responses, imagined difficult questions, and quietly promised myself that I would remain patient if another disagreement appeared. This time, my mind remained surprisingly still. I was not driving there to solve anything. I was driving there to see my mother. That difference mattered more than I realized. She greeted me at the front door wearing gardening gloves and smiled with the same warmth I remembered from years ago. "I thought we could have coffee outside," she said. "The tulips are finally blooming." We carried 2 mugs onto the back porch and settled into the rocking chairs my father had purchased during the winter. Birds moved between the trees while sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves that had only recently returned after the long cold season. For several minutes, we simply admired the garden. My mother pointed out flowers beginning to bloom, explaining which ones needed more sunlight and which ones would not appear until early summer. Listening to her speak so naturally reminded me that there had once been a time when conversations like this required no effort at all. Eventually, she looked toward me with a thoughtful expression. "Your father told me you helped him choose these chairs," she said. I nodded. "He wanted something you would enjoy for many years." She gently rested one hand on the wooden armrest. "He chose well." Another quiet moment passed before she surprised me again. "Claire told me you have been writing." I smiled. "She tells you everything." My mother laughed softly. "Only when she thinks it might help." I admitted that I had started keeping a journal filled with memories. Her expression immediately became curious. "Arguments?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Mostly stories about growing up. Things I did not want to forget." She looked down at the coffee in her hands before speaking again. "That sounds nicer than keeping score." Her words were gentle, yet they carried enough honesty to make me pause. Months earlier, I might have explained myself or reminded her that I had never intended to keep score. Instead, I simply answered, "I think we both became too focused on protecting our own thoughts and forgot to protect our memories together." She slowly nodded. "I believe you are right." It was the first time in a very long while that neither of us seemed interested in defending anything. The conversation continued without urgency. We talked about my grandparents, about neighbors who had moved away years before, about the little grocery store where my mother used to buy penny candy whenever Claire and I earned good report cards. Every story seemed to lead naturally into another, until she quietly disappeared into the house for a few minutes before returning with a small cedar chest. She placed it on the table between us and opened the lid. Inside were birthday cards, handmade drawings, school photographs, and folded notes that stretched back across decades. She carefully picked up a faded piece of notebook paper covered in uneven handwriting. "You were 8 years old," she said with a smile. "You wrote this after I caught the flu." I barely remembered it. She handed me the paper, and I read the simple words aloud. I had promised that when I grew up I would always take care of her, because she had always taken care of me. The spelling was imperfect. Several words were crossed out and rewritten. Yet the feeling behind them remained unmistakable. I looked up to find tears quietly resting in my mother's eyes. "I kept it because I never doubted you meant every word," she whispered. My own voice became softer than I expected. "I still do." She reached across the small table and gently covered my hand with hers. "Daniel, I know we see some things differently now. Maybe we always will. But somewhere along the way I became afraid that our differences mattered more to you than we did." I turned my hand over and held hers. "I never wanted that," I said honestly. "I thought if I explained myself better, eventually you would understand what I meant." She smiled sadly. "And I thought if I kept trying to protect you, eventually you would understand what I feared." We both laughed quietly at the realization. Two people who loved each other had spent months speaking sincerely while answering completely different questions. The silence that followed no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. We watched the breeze move through the garden without feeling any pressure to fill every moment with words. For the first time since all of this had begun, I understood that reconciliation rarely arrives through one perfect sentence. It grows through dozens of small moments when two people choose curiosity instead of certainty, patience instead of pride, and presence instead of persuasion. As the afternoon sun slowly drifted across the backyard, I realized we had not solved every disagreement. We had done something far more important. We had finally begun hearing the heart behind each other's words instead of only listening for the next point to answer. Summer arrived quietly, almost without anyone noticing. The tulips had long since faded, replaced by roses blooming along the fence my father had repaired the previous year. Sunday dinners slowly became regular again, not because every disagreement had disappeared, but because we had stopped expecting perfection before allowing ourselves to sit at the same table. Looking back now, I realized that healing did not happen during one extraordinary conversation. It happened through dozens of ordinary ones. It happened when my mother called simply to ask whether Emily's tomatoes were growing well in our backyard. It happened when I stopped by after work just to help my father replace a light fixture without wondering whether the afternoon might become emotionally exhausting. It happened when my mother began sending me newspaper clippings about local community events instead of articles she hoped would persuade me of anything. Little by little, our relationship returned to something that felt familiar, although not identical to what it had once been. In some ways, it became stronger because it had finally learned how to survive disappointment. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after that unforgettable dinner, our family gathered once again around the same oak table that had witnessed so many celebrations, disagreements, birthdays, and holidays. Ethan was taller than I remembered. Claire laughed more easily than she had in months, and my father still insisted on carving the roast, even though everyone teased him about taking far too long. My mother moved through the kitchen with the same quiet confidence she had always carried, occasionally stopping to smile at the conversations filling every room. At one point, she looked toward me from across the table, and for just a second we both remembered how different everything had once felt. This time, however, neither of us looked away. We simply smiled. After dinner, while everyone else remained inside talking, I walked onto the back porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. My mother followed a few moments later and settled into her favorite rocking chair. The evening air was warm, and the sound of crickets had already begun drifting across the yard. We sat together for several minutes without speaking. Years earlier, I would have felt obligated to fill that silence. Now it felt comfortable, like an old friend returning after a long trip. Finally, my mother smiled. "Do you remember how frightened I was when you left for college?" she asked. I laughed softly. "You called every evening during the first week." She nodded with a quiet smile. "I kept wondering whether you would still need me." I looked at her carefully. "I have never stopped needing you. I just needed you in different ways." She considered those words before slowly nodding. I think that was the lesson I struggled to learn. I understood exactly what she meant because I had struggled with a lesson of my own. I had believed that love required agreement more often than it actually does. I had assumed that if 2 people truly cared about each other, they would eventually reach the same conclusions. Life had taught me something far more complicated and far more beautiful. Love is not measured by how often 2 people arrive at the same answer. It is measured by whether they remain willing to ask each other honest questions even after discovering that their answers may never be identical. My mother reached into the pocket of her light sweater and handed me a folded piece of paper. "I found this while cleaning last week," she said. When I unfolded it, I realized it was a copy of the note I had written as an 8-year-old promising to take care of her when I grew up. She had carefully made a photocopy and kept the original safely inside her cedar chest. At the bottom of the page, she had recently added one handwritten sentence. "Growing older means learning that taking care of each other sometimes begins by listening." I read the sentence twice before looking up. She smiled warmly. I thought we both earned that reminder. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my wallet. It remains there even today. Every time I see it, I remember that relationships are rarely damaged by a single disagreement. More often, they are weakened by the quiet belief that being understood matters more than understanding. The opposite is also true. Relationships are restored one patient conversation at a time, one act of grace at a time, one decision to remain curious instead of defensive. My mother and I still disagree about certain things. We probably always will. Sometimes we laugh about it. Sometimes we simply acknowledge the difference and move on to talking about the grandchildren, the weather, my father's latest home improvement project, or the flowers blooming outside her kitchen window. What changed was not the existence of disagreement. What changed was the place it occupied in our lives. It was no longer sitting at the head of the table. Family was. When I think back to everything that happened, I no longer remember one difficult question or one carefully chosen answer as the defining moment of our story. Instead, I remember an aging mother who quietly kept every birthday card her son had ever given her because she never stopped believing that love deserved to be preserved. I remember a father who understood that fixing relationships required the same patience as repairing an old porch. I remember a sister who gently reminded both of us what we were truly fighting to protect. Most of all, I remember discovering that facts can inform our minds, but only humility can keep our hearts open. That lesson did not change what I believed. It changed how I chose to love the people who believed differently, and in the end, that made all the difference.